Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am Mariana Skilakaki, Editor-in-Chief of Athenea, and I will be moderating today's event, organized by the Hans Seidel Foundation and the Institute for Democracy Konstantinos Karamanlis, entitled Reform of the EU Stability and Growth Pact, Seeking the Gold Mean. The pandemic era, but also the escalating tension of the past few weeks in Ukraine, have both shown us the need for Europe to adopt a more unified approach on matters of foreign policy. But what about fiscal policy? What's next for the Stability and Growth Pact, whose rules had been repealed for the duration of the pandemic, but are now due to re-enter into force in 2023? Some countries in the EU, including Greece, are pushing for a permanent loosening of the rules, perhaps even replacing the rigid 60% debt limit with individual requirements for debt reduction that will take into account the situation of individual countries. Others worry about where such a loosening could lead, even hoping to introduce stricter sanctions for violations. Can the EU reach a compromise? That is precisely the topic of today's event. Now, before we dive in, I would like to invite our hosts, Jenny KAPELLOU, head of the Athens office of the Hans Seidel Foundation, and Panos STATHOPOULOS, director of the Institute for Democracy Konstantinos Karamanlis, to make their introductory remarks. Ms. KAPELLOU, the floor is yours.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, Μαριάννα. Εκ μέρους του Ιδρύματος
Thank you very much, Mariana. On behalf of the Hans Seidel Foundation, I would like to welcome you to today's event that will discuss the reform of the EU Stability and Growth Pact. The Stability and Growth Pact is an important pillar for the stability of Europe. However, the consequences of the pandemic make it necessary to reform this pact. This is exactly going to be the discussion of today. We are looking at the gold mean, the right dosage of stability and flexibility so as to give room to the member states to recover, but also at the same time make the EU competitive globally. At this point, I would like to thank today's guest speakers who responded to our invitation. I would also like to thank Panos Stathopoulos, the director of the Institute for Democracy, Konstantinos Karamanlis, for the good cooperation. Let me give the floor to Mr. Stathopoulos.
Hello, on behalf of the Institute for Democracy, Konstantinos Karamanlis, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for taking part in today's discussion. A discussion that is essentially linked to the extent to which the pandemic has already been surpassed, as many academics argue. Because if things evolve as expected, it is a certain issue. The Growth and Stability Pact, the Stability and Growth Pact will be at the core of discussions at EU level. This is also the topic for today's discussion. I would like to pinpoint the interest vested with this subject. I would also like to thank our distinguished guests and our wonderful moderator, to whom I would like to give the floor now. Thank you.
For our discussion and for organizing today's event. Next, I have the honor of welcoming our two keynote speakers, Professor Gikas HARDOUVELIS, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the National Bank of Greece and former Minister of Finance, who will be followed by Markus FERBER, Member of the European Parliament and Chairman of the Hans Seidel Foundation. Professor HARDOUVELIS, the floor is yours for your opening remarks to our discussion.
Thank you, Mariana. And let me see if I can share my presentation. Does everybody see it? I assume you do. I'd like to also to thank the Institute of Democracy, Konstantinos Karamanlis, and of course, the Hans Seidel Foundation for inviting me. I'll try to give you a brief introduction to the topic of reform of the EU Stability and Growth Pact, seeking the golden mean. And as you all know, let me see, yeah. The Stability and Growth Pact is really a substitute for the missing fiscal union in EMU. It is a set of rules on proper fiscal policy so that monetary policy is not overburdened. We created EMU, but we did not create a political union, so SGP came a couple of years later to fill in the vacuum. Now, history shows that the European project keeps improving over time in small steps and in continuous compromise. In fact, the same thing holds true for SGP. Jumps in policy occur only after crises. For example, the Greek crisis that we all went through led to the beginning of the banking union and the establishment of the European Stability Mechanism. And now this pandemic crisis also pushed Europe into new fiscal territory. I mean, there was a large fiscal expansion, which was unprecedented and nobody had expected. And it was based on the escape clause to the Stability and Growth Pact. So the escape clause materialized. This also brought a partial mutualization of debt, something that we discussed during the Greek crisis, but this didn't materialize. It didn't materialize this time. And I think we have opened up the possibility of the establishment of a central adjustment account that a lot of academics talk about. Now, to briefly go back to the history, I have this slide. I'm not going to go into the details, just to let you know that after the Maastricht Treaty of 1992 that set the 3% deficit limit and the 60% debt limit, the Stability and Growth Pact came 5 years later to sort of say, how would countries behave after they joined EMU? And it sort of followed these previous rules. And a big change in the Stability and Growth Pact occurred exactly because of the Greek crisis. And you will see that, you will see here, the European semester happened in 2010, the six-pack in 2011, the fiscal compact, which brought items into our constitutions in 2012, the two-pack in 2013. So it was the Greek crisis that brought the first changes into the Stability and Growth Pact. And I should say that by 2014-15, the major change that occurred was a change of emphasis from the 3% limit to an emphasis on the so-called structural deficit, which is less procyclical than the ordinary deficit. And new rules were imposed on the structural deficit, saying that you shouldn't be have a structural deficit higher than 0.5% of GDP. And if you are, of course, a good country, a country with low debt, we can let you with 1% of GDP. Now, since then, there has been a lot of discussion, lots of arguments, lots of criticism on this new switch. People complain that it is not as clear as before. The rules are very complex. Structural deficits often get revised, etc., etc. I mean, there are many criticisms about the Stability and Growth Pact. The time inconsistency issues of penalties is another issue that we don't have time to discuss today. But I can loosely summarize, I think, the state of the art by 2014-15, at the end of the Greek crisis, by saying that the prescription to member states was the following: utilize the good times to build a fiscal cushion in order to be able to follow a counter-cyclical fiscal policy on your own if a negative shock were to occur in the future. So the idea is, if every country followed this type of rule, then you wouldn't need to have a central fiscal mechanism and do transfers, because each country would be able to do a counter-cyclical fiscal policy when a bad shock occurred. Now, what happened? Let me give you, what was the picture before the pandemic? Because we know that the pandemic changed a lot of that stuff. What was the picture? Were the countries okay in 2019, the year before the pandemic started. And what I have on the slide is the two indicators, the gross government debt as a percent of GDP on the x-axis, and the fiscal balance as a percent of GDP, the old, the 3% rule on the y-axis. And what we see is that in 2019, amazingly, almost all countries except one, is Romania on the graph, actually observed the deficit limit. But half the countries were above the debt limit. So the debt is the major constraint, the big issue. And we know that, by the way, that between 2014-15 and 2019 was a period of positive growth in Europe. Almost every country had positive growth, I think, perhaps with one exception. Every country had positive growth. So the question that comes up is that, okay, we saw a change in the Stability and Growth Pact, presumably for the better. Did the countries actually behave with the new rules? Namely, did they use the good times to build buffers so they can actually follow fiscal relaxation in bad times? Now, if you look into this graph on the screen, here I have the structural balance in 2014 on the horizontal axis, and the structural balance in 2019 on the vertical axis. Together with a 45-degree line, a red line. What this shows that a lot of countries is on the left low quadrant, which says that, boy, they had structural deficits both in 2014 and in 2019. But what's more interesting is that a lot of the countries are below the 45-degree line. Namely, they were in trouble in 2014, and they didn't shape up in 2019. They had even higher structural deficit in 2019. This just gives you a flavor that perhaps the new rules were good, but perhaps they didn't push the countries to do the right thing, to build these buffers. And I have a final graph which takes a more long-term view and compares decades, the decade of the 2000s and the decades of the 2010s, 10 years each. And on the horizontal axis, the change of debt as a percent of GDP in percentage points from the first to the second decade. And the vertical axis is the change in public investment as a percent of GDP from the first decade to the second. What you see there is, again, a similar story that lots of countries, see the red countries are countries that started with a huge debt to begin with. These countries actually increased their debt. Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Italy, France, etc. And so from one decade to the next, instead of improving, they deteriorate. And what's even worse is if you look into the details of their budgets, during these decades, they cut public investment. This is a big issue nowadays in Europe. Unless you have investment, you cannot hope for long-term growth. In fact, there's a negative correlation. I have the regression line there, which shows that countries that did worse on the debt part, they also did worse on the public investment. So all I want to say is that history and life tells us that we better do something. We need to enter this debate and change the Stability and Growth Pact, provide incentives, reform the penalties, do smart things to make sure that countries do follow the rules and do they do at the same time have flexibility. And the way I see the current debate is that there are three schools out there, and Mariana summarized them more or less. The first one is that people, some countries say, look, the current framework, namely the framework in 2019, needs little reform. Let's just not abandon it. Let's stick to it. And then there are other countries that the third set I have here that say we need a complete overhaul of the rules. Nothing has worked. It seems like we're in a big mess. We do need fiscal policy to work together with monetary policy. We need to replace even numerical targets, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's always the middle that says fiscal rules need to be adapted, yet within the current framework. And if you were to ask me, I think eventually the debate will probably land in the middle, since Europe needs to work with consensus and takes time to take decisions. Most likely we're going to be in the middle. And when I bring up the issue that already the countries, 10 countries that belong to the first group, the ones that say don't change much, go back to the previous framework, to the whatever, the 3% rule, et cetera, the finance ministers wrote a common letter, and they published it in the media across Europe a month, I think, ago or two. I'm not sure. I saw it some time ago, where essentially they say, look, let's go back to what we had before the pandemic and do not tie going back to the previous time with the reform. The reform can take forever. Let's worry about the reform later. Now I tend to think that's not the way to go. A crisis is something good and you shouldn't waste it. Anyway, it turns out in this whole discussion that has started, the EU Fiscal Council, by the way, the councils were established right during the Greek crisis. The EU Fiscal Council, which is the watchdog for doing the right thing fiscally, essentially said three main propositions. The first proposition was we ought to treat each large debtor country, countries like Greece or Italy or whatever, with large debt to GDP differently. We ought to have one size that does not fit all shoes. So we better have a different approach per country when it comes to debt. That was number one. Number two, and this is very important, it's being discussed for many, many years now, particularly lately, switch away from the structural deficit, go into an expenditure benchmark, put a lid on expenditure growth being lower than GDP growth. That's a typical, and it's an observable indicator. It's single. It doesn't get confused. Of course, you can have escape clauses. You can talk about the details, but move in that direction. Put a lid of where the problem is, that countries tend to spend a lot. But in an attempt to appease the hardliners, they said, keep the old 3% threshold on the deficit as a backstop. So keep it in case it gets violated, then it would trigger an excessive deficit procedure, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the Fiscal Council has set the stage, and I think the debate will be around these three major principles. And different countries will try to pull the debate either softer or harder. And so, for example, we're going to see a new definition of public expenditure. Already, what's defined as public expenditure is net of interest payments. So it's net of non-discretionary unemployment benefits, and it's net of discretionary revenue measures. That the Commission already described it back in 2015. What's new in the debate is whether you will also net out public investment, especially green investment, which is the holy grail of Europe nowadays. So the debate will be there. I think we're going to see something on investment, and it's going to be, the whole question is going to be, how do we amortize it, et cetera, et cetera. The second item that people will concentrate on is, what about the medium-term budgetary objectives? Are they still going to be looked at as corrective measures, or simply should we look at them as preventive measures? I'm not going to enter into this. And the final, and I think there's going to be a lot of discussion on this, is about the central fiscal capacity. The fact that we have the Resilience and Recovery Fund, a lot of people see it as the first way to move towards a macroeconomic stabilization mechanism. Are we going to see a stabilization mechanism going on? How large and how frequent? So I think the debate will concentrate on that. Now, to close, so not and I'll let the audience separate debate all of these things. I should say that I'm optimistic. that this crisis will not go to waste. It will lead to a better functioning EU and EMU. Eventually, Europeans do it in the end. The time of reform, however, is now. I don't agree with the 10 finance ministers that say, let's leave it forever. We can, let's search it more and more. We know the problems. We have a lot of these ideas are floating around for many, many years. Let's move on now and close in. And my sort of motto on this is we should think of the Stability and Growth Pact not as a dilemma between rules versus discretion. Rather, we should see it as that rules and discretion can work together. Discretion can work within a proper governance framework. In other words, we should see proposals that are both discipline improving and stabilization improving, and they do not necessarily contradict each other. They can coexist. A lot of academics have discussed a lot of these items. I think that's how we should move. And I also think we should be, in the back of our minds, we should have the big issues of the next decade, like climate change, digitalization, investment needs, and aging population. They should enter somehow in the equation of the debate. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Professor HARDOUVELIS, for setting the stage for us and laying the foundations. I think we now have a much better understanding both of what's at stake, but also the process that has led us to where we are today. And I took particular note of the difference between deficit and debt limit adherence in the past. That's something that I think we can discuss a bit more in the next portion of our discussion, but also the fact that countries weren't able to do what they were meant to do during the good times. And that's also a very important remark that we need to keep into account now that we're in a position to reform the SGP, if we choose to go down that direction. Thank you so much. We will now listen to a video message from Markus FERBER, member of the European Parliament and chairman of the Hans Seidel Foundation, before moving on to the panel session that will follow.
Ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Brussels and a warm welcome on behalf of the Hans Seidel Foundation to the online event on the issue of reforming the EU Stability and Growth Pact. Unfortunately, I'm not able to join the debate in person due to conflicting obligation as member of the European Parliament, but nevertheless, the importance of the addressed topic can't be ranked highly enough within our discourse on the future of European project. This is why I want to underline its importance with my message and thank to you for your interest and participation. The Stability and Growth Pact as an essential component of economic governance in the European Union remains under constant pressure to ease the standards on debt and deficit spending. This would mean a departure of its central function to ensure sound public finances and thus to conserve the solid footing of the Economic and Monetary Union. An aim which should be crucial not only during a prosperous economy or surpluses in national budgets, but accompanying discussions to reform the Stability and Growth Pact try to undermine the proven principles that secure the assets of hard-working people and the middle class in Europe. Therefore, I want to add my gratitude for the Institute for Democracy Konstantinos Karamanlis and the Office of the Hans Seidel Foundation in Athens for organizing this exchange. The Stability and Growth Pact and its aspired reform is a vital topic about what defines the fiscal and economic culture of our continental entity in present and, of course, in future. The Institute for Democracy has been an important and close partner of our foundation at a number of joint events for many years. Together, we raise ambitious and sensitive topics on European development to include the people in Greece and Germany, especially Bavaria, into the opinion-building process. This openness demonstrates the strength of our democracy and of the European spirit to seek solutions through participation and including as many perceptions as possible. I'm grateful to see that so many highly qualified personalities have joined the panel for today's online discussion. Representative for all panelists, I want to greet Professor Gikas HARDOUVELIS, the chairman of directors of the National Bank of Greece, who served as finance minister of the Hellenic Republic between 2014 and 2015. His expertise and experience will not only enrich the ensuing discussion, but his voice will also be of great importance for the debate in Europe on the Stability and Growth Pact. Thank you for your support, of your engagement, and to all involved, thank you for this contribution to a very complex debate. Please allow me to donate some food for thoughts to your following discussion. In 2021, last year, with regard to reforming the Stability and Growth Pact, the European People's Party already stated very clearly that we have to move towards a more effective EU fiscal framework. What drove us were the lessons we believe have to be learned from recent past. The financial and sovereign debt crisis last decade has shown that unsustainable fiscal policies might easily result in severe problems for the entire economy and monetary union. This is why the Stability and Growth Pact has undergone a comprehensive review in 2011, which has strengthened the budgetary control mechanisms and has introduced flexibility mechanisms. The past years demonstrated that even the Reform Stability and Growth Pact did not live up to its expectations. On the one hand, the implementation of the Stability and Growth Pact continued to be a point of contention between the Commission and the Member States. On the other hand, the Stability and Growth Pact failed to prevent the build-up of high debt levels in many Member States. Even during a relatively benign macroeconomic environment during the 2012 to 2019 period, when the average debt levels in the Eurozone started to decline, many Member States failed to build sufficient fiscal buffers. In fact, the debt to GDP ratio continued to climb in many Member States, revealing the shortcomings of the current framework. In addition to this already existing state of unconsolidated debts, the stimulus programs adopted to combat the corona crisis have caused government debt to skyrocket throughout Europe. In the Eurozone, public debt averaged 100% of gross domestic product in the last year. And in many Member States, it was even higher. In order to be able to respond appropriately to the economic side effects of the corona pandemic, the European debt rules vested in the Stability and Growth Pact were temporarily suspended in 2020 and last year and are not scheduled to take effect again until next year. For financial stability in the European Union and thus the stability of the common currency, high government debt is a problem. It is probably now a bipartisan consensus that the Stability and Growth Pact is indeed a fundamental and sustainable reform, but not in which direction. I share the basic assessments that a fundamental update and refurbishment is necessary. However, I view many of the ideas being discussed in this context with great concern. In particular, for example, Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi and French President Emmanuel Macron are pushing for a relaxation of European debt rules. In doing so, they fail to realize that the economic difficulties that have plagued Italy and France in recent years are not due to an overly tight corset from Europe, but to homemade problems. Important structural reforms have been neglected in these two member states for decades, which has cost them ever more in terms of competitiveness. Even more lax European debt rules would not change these problems at all. It is to be welcomed that the European Commission is coordinating and moderating the ongoing consultation on a possible adjustment of the Stability and Growth Pact, including own proposals. However, The actual role of the European Commission as guardian of the treaties must also be critically examined when it comes to enforcing the principles of the Stability and Growth Pact in the member states. The Commission has never initiated sanctions against deficit sinners, not against Germany, not against any other. Another cause that led to an increase in public debt in many EU member states without regulatory consequences, even in economically good times. Currently, it seems there is no discernible path for how we can reach the reference values from the European treaties in perspective. And apparently, we are also lacking effective instruments for enforcement. To be frank, I consider proposals for a relaxation of the Stability and Growth Pact to be a fire hazard, because the current high level of debt is only sustainable as long as the European Central Bank keeps interest rates low and itself acts as a buyer of government bonds on the secondary markets. If the European Central Bank exits its ultra-loose monetary policy, which would be urgent in view of rising inflationary pressure, the refinancing costs of many member states will also rise noticeably, where this can lead in the worst case we saw a few years ago. This experience must not be repeated under any circumstances, which is why we now need to reverse the trend in government debt and lead the way to enforce economic prosperity without increasing the burden for future generations. From our own experience, you know which divergent ideas and interests influence the reform debate. This makes it all the more important to exchange ideas with each other in order to contribute as much expertise and creativity as possible. However, despite all ambitions to modernize the Stability and Growth Pact and to take individual starting points into account, the initial idea should remain the core of the reform, to ensure value stability for the people and our economy. There are many fields where we can improve the Stability and Growth Pact, for example, by reducing and simplifying regulations, use observable and influenceable key figures as base for decisions, ensuring an effective control by independent institutions, and strengthening the preventive elements of the Pact. In any case, I can guarantee you, I will do my utmost in the European Parliament to ensure that the revision of the Stability and Growth Pact is indeed stability-oriented. With this in mind, I wish you now a fruitful discussion and look forward on ideas and proposals on this task. And of course, to see you all as soon as possible in person again. Thank you very much.
Now we thank Mr. Ferber for his valuable contribution to the debate. His perspective was quite different to Professor HARDOUVELIS, which came before, but we all seem to agree that change is necessary. The direction of change, that's the million-dollar question, I suppose, that we will try to talk about during our panel discussion, which we are now kicking off. So to discuss this important topic at this critical crossroads for Europe, I have the honor of welcoming Mr. Zsolt DARVAS, Senior Fellow at the Bruegel Institute in Brussels, Professor Michael ARGHYROU, Chairman of Greece's Economic Advisors and Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics of the University of Piraeus, Dr. Thomas GSTÄDNER, President of the Supervisory Board and Chairman of the General Assembly of the European Banking Institute, and of course, last but not least, Professor Nikos Vetas, General Director of IOVE, the Foundation for Economic and Industrial Research, and Professor at the University of Economics and Business. Thank you all so much for joining us. Now, I would like to pose my first question to you, Mr. DARVAS, and to get a sense of the limitations and shortcomings of the current SGP. Could you summarize the current debate surrounding its redesign in light of this reactivation in 2023?
Thank you for the question, but first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. I very much enjoyed the first keynote speakers, Mr. HARDOUVELIS and Mr. FERBER, and I have to say I have a lot of agreement. Now, coming to your question on what are the major shortcomings, Mr. Gikas, HARDOUVELIS, I think already described many of them. I personally regard the most important is the reliance on unobserved variables, because the rules very much depend on the so-called structural budget balance, which is the actual budget balance cleaned from the impact of the economic cycle. You know, in good times there are more tax revenues, in bad times there are less tax revenues and more unemployment benefit payments. And these structural balances are estimated very, very imprecisely. They are revised very frequently. And even, you know, there have been even a revision in the sign in the change. For example, for France, for a particular year, the change in the structural balance suggested that France made a budget consolidation. But a year later, the new estimate suggested that in the same year, there was no budget consolidation, but instead a budget relaxation, so fiscal stimulus. So we simply cannot rely for operational purposes on indicators which are so unprecisely measured. And indeed, I think a major aim of the reform would be or should be to get rid of these unobserved variables and instead rely on more observable variables, like, for example, the expenditure rule, which has also been mentioned. I think that's a very, very good alternative, especially if that is combined with country-specific debt targets. Another major issue, I think, with the current rules is that they are indeed very complex. Very few people can oversee the whole framework, how it works. It's also difficult to see to what degree discretion and flexibility can be exploited. The Commission published a couple of documents on, for example, there was one in 2015 on how greater flexibility could be used. Why those measures were included, why not others, whether there are further possibilities for doing more flexibility, that's not really known. So again, the Pact is complex and opaque. Another major issue is certainly lack of national ownership. So countries viewing these rules, you know, as you know, they have to comply to some degree, but you know, there is still a room for maneuver for arguing with the Commission, and you know, they try to follow their national fiscal plans and do a little to please the Commission, hoping that the Commission will not start any adverse actions or any sanctions against them. And again, I mean, this is not a good framework. I mean, a framework should be seen by domestic players, both in the national parliament, but also various stakeholders, you know, as a very useful device to keep public finances under control, to the benefit of the society and the economy. So clearly, I think there was a major case for reform. Now, your question also asked about the current discussions, and indeed, I think Mr. Ferber's comment itself highlights that it's not a clear-cut issue. I mean, he also mentioned that he's in favor of reform, but again, he at the same time expressed his cautious view on a number of proposals which are on the table, and I think it very well describes, you know, the current state. You know, some member states are pushing for stronger reforms, others insisting that, you know, this is a law. It has been enshrined in the constitution of EU member states. If there is a law, we should abide by the law. We shouldn't change it. So my fear is that not much will come out of the reform. But there is one issue where I think particular attention should be paid, and that is, you know, climate transition and green public investment. Because from next year, you know, the rules will be reinstated. In my estimation, about half of EU countries will be in the so-called corrective arm. I mean, not meeting the 3% budget deficit rule. Another half, or a bit less than the other half in the preventive arm, but also many of the preventive arm countries have not yet reached their more medium-term objective. So basically, with the exception of a few countries like Luxembourg and Denmark, I think all other 24 EU countries will have to do fiscal consolidation. But if the countries start doing fiscal consolidation, they will not have the room for increasing climate investment. Now, for a country like Greece, but also Italy, it's less of a problem at the moment, because Greece, Italy, and some other Southern European and Central European countries get a lot of money from Next Generation EU, and in particular from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and about 40% of that is spent on green investments. So at least for Southern Europe, I think the green issue is, at least for a couple of years, more or less covered by the Recovery and Resilience Facility. But for the rest of Europe, and I can say most of Europe, I mean, Western European countries, this is not the case. Those countries also need to spend much more. And I'm very much afraid that this will simply not happen under the current rules. So, I mean, there are also different options on how to foster green investments. But maybe let me stop with this comment, emphasizing that indeed, climate change, if we don't do anything, it will be an irreversible process. It will have major devastating impact on the environment, on people, on the sea level rise, the temperature rise. And so this is no time to waste. We should do urgently something about that. And fiscal policy in Europe has a strong role for that. But under the current rules, I'm afraid this is not going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. DARVAS. And it's a fascinating parameter how you can encourage green investment while still having a good framework. I also take note of two things you said. You mentioned, the need to make the pact less opaque. I think there's a lot of agreement that we can reach on this specific topic, even across countries. It needs to be less opaque, but also the question of sanctions. I mean, you can't really have a framework if there's no enforcing mechanism, or if nobody thinks there's an enforcing mechanism until it's too late. Now, let me turn to you, Professor ARGHYROU, to get a better sense of the Greek position and the position of certain southern countries, let's say, on the reform of the SGP in the direction of individual requirements for debt reduction. And also, as a follow-up question, how does the current debt rule affect the growth prospects of countries with a high ratio of debt to GDP at the moment?
Thank you very much, Mariana, and let me thank the organizers for extending an invitation to me for this highly interesting and prestigious event. Now, regarding our approach to the debate of the review of the fiscal governance framework, I think that our approach is quite middle of the ground and very mainstream economics-wise. To start with the first observation, as Professor HARDOUVELIS mentioned, in the absence of a centralized fiscal capacity in a monetary union, you need coordination of fiscal policies, and therefore, without centralized fiscal policy, the existence of rules is unquestionable and necessary. So I don't think that anybody really objects to the existence of rules. These are necessary in a monetary union. They are necessary for fiscal and overall macro sustainability, that's for sure. And then the question is, what type of rules do we need? And given that we have a set of rules, whether the present set of rules is now, under the circumstances, given the present environment, fit for purpose, or they are in need of change, and if so, to which direction? Well, one thing that characterizes rules in general is that they are typically set on the basis of past information. So rules are set given a certain environment, and then they are followed. But if the environment changes and the rules do not keep up with the changed environment, then rather than a force of coordination and progress, rules risk becoming a force of regression. And this is indeed an argument made by Francis Fukuyama in his seminal work on the origins of political order. So, should we review our rules? Is there a fundamental change in the economic environment in which we are living relative to 2 or 3 years ago? And I think that the answer is yes. The pandemic, which was a completely exogenous shock, nobody's fault, as other speakers have already mentioned, increased very substantially public debt levels. So what do we do now? Taking, for example, your question on the debt rule. Are we to apply the debt rule, the so-called 1/20th rule? If we apply the 1/20th rule, mainstream economics, irrespective of any ideological positions, tell you that we will have a very, very significant front-loaded fiscal adjustment. Is this the best we can do for the recovery of our economies, for the building up of production capacity, for addressing challenges like those that Zsolt mentioned on the green investment and transition, as well as the digital transition? Probably not. So, despite the fact that we have a very, very major fiscal impetus from the Recovery and Resilience Fund, still a lot of fiscal action will take place at the national level. And in our view, the enormity of the shock of the pandemic justifies revisiting some rules like the 1/20th rule, but others too. Naturally, we should not lose sight what Mr. Ferber mentioned about the importance of fiscal sustainability holds true. We should not believe that we can have economies which will be producing prosperity for their citizens if we do not have sound public finances. That is unquestionable. So the reform should not make us under-ambitious with regards to debt reduction. We acknowledge that bringing debt to a steadily declining path is necessary to ensure fiscal sustainability and long-term growth. But at the same time, in view of the fundamentally changed fiscal outlook that I mentioned before, and also given the experience from the past, I'm now mentioning the experience of the double recession back in 2011 to 2014, we should also not be overambitious. Neither underambition nor overambition should characterize the way we go forward. We think that we should opt for a balanced debt reduction approach that should be unrecognizable in terms of direction, but at the same time realistic in size, gradual pace, and growth-friendly nature to avoid adverse effects on actual or potential GDP, employment, and cohesion. I think that if we get it wrong one way or another, markets are quite alert. If we basically send the message that we push fiscal consolidation too much to the horizon, markets will react. But if we say to markets that we are going to do something that they do not regard feasible, again, they will react. So we should get it right. We should make sure that what we say has market credibility on both directions. Now, as I have already mentioned, we are going to have obviously a lot of discussions at the European level. The outcome that will emerge, in our view, should make sure that we do not, I have already mentioned that, result into too much front-loaded adjustment in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. More generally, the rules should not be pro-cyclical as they have been in the past. Again, I will invoke the experience of the previous crisis of 2011 to 2014. That was a very telling experience. We should make sure that we have an anti-cyclical fiscal policy rather than a pro-cyclical fiscal policy. I think that Zsolt is very right. The new rules should make room for dealing with the two main challenges of our times, which are the green transition and the digital transition. There are huge investment needs in both areas, and those predated the pandemic. I remember when I joined AWG, we were discussing quite a lot about the digital transformation and the fact that in Europe we have been having a lot of challenges relative to other jurisdictions. And when it comes to digital transition, one might say that there are returns to private investments, but this is not necessarily the case when it comes to green investments. So we should make sure that there is money in order to invest in those two critical aspects. And by the way, these have clear externalities between countries. If we invest in environment in Greece, that will have positive effects for countries next door and vice versa. So this is something that benefits everybody. And we also think that there are other areas where positive externalities do exist, and national investment in one country benefits others. And this very much touches upon the European strategic autonomy. For example, we view areas like migration and defense as areas which have such positive externalities for all countries. Now, let me wrap up by saying a couple of comments. The first is that I agree that national ownership of the fiscal framework is particularly important for the effective implementation. So we are quite open to exploring ways, perhaps through a positive incentives approach like the one characterizing the RRF, in order to ensure compliance with rules. And also, let me say that whatever we decide, we should not forget that fiscal policy is a part of a general policy mix. So we should be mindful of the impact of our fiscal policy decisions and the setup of the fiscal environment on the way other policies are conducted. We should not be resulting into, if you like, conflicting priorities between various parts of the overall policy mix. So it is a big agenda. Obviously, there are valid points of view from all sides. I think that we should be approaching this debate in a way that is pragmatic, evidence-based, without regard to ideologies or fixed ideas. And as Professor HARDOUVELIS said, the European way is a way of cooperation. It's a way of finding common ground, and I am hopeful that this will be the case on this occasion as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for also pointing out just how interconnected the European Union is and how we need to think of the bigger picture and not just the individual countries' approaches to things. I'd like to turn to the other side of the debate somewhat and turn to Dr. GSTÄDNER to get a bit of a view on the key concerns regarding the permanent relaxation of the debt and deficit rules of the SGP. What are these countries that are objecting to such a shift worried about? And is there room for a compromise solution in your opinion?
First of all, thanks very much also for the invitation. And thanks also to the speakers before me. For answering the question, it is quite useful, I think, to look back why the SGP, so the Stability and Growth Pact, was introduced in the first place. And it was introduced as a permanent fiscal coordination instrument to ensure that the monetary union will remain a stability union with a hard currency. And such a currency requires some form of fiscal coordination, as also the speakers before me have said. And I think the reason why it was introduced are still valid. So for a monetary policy point of view, unsustainable fiscal policies could lead to pressure on the ECB to relax monetary policy, and in this way have an impact on the stability of the currency. The second point is high debt could create spillover effects on other countries in the currency union via higher interest rates or financial stability concerns. And third, it is clear that in a currency union, there is a need for a macroprudential stabilization tool in the case of economic shocks. It was mentioned before as well. In the EU, this is done first and foremost by the member states. The Pact shall ensure that each member state has the necessary fiscal buffers to absorb macroeconomic shocks if they arise. And this is also important because we have a no bailout clause in the treaty. You can now obviously discuss how successful the Pact was, but I would like to mention here one positive thing. Yeah? And I think the first speaker has mentioned this as well. At the end of the big economic cycle like 2019, the Eurozone had a lower deficit level than other big economies. It was 0.5% deficit to GDP. Obviously differences between the member countries, but it was lower than in other countries. And the idea is to lower deficits in a booming economy in order to have fiscal space to spend more in a downturn. And this requires debt and deficit rules. So I think the first part of the equation, I think you need debt and deficit rules. And I guess this was also unanimous view here. To the second part of the question, I think from an economic point of view, there is a room to adapt the rules of the SGP. The aim should be to make it simpler, first of all, but also more transparent and then also more binding. And the lack of transparency is what is, I think, currently most criticized with the SGP, but only a few technical experts really understand the rules. There are also a few technical adjustments which could make sense. One obvious candidate would be the rule that requires member states with debt levels beyond 60% to GDP to bring them down by 1/20 of debt excess value each year. I think that was mentioned before as well. With the current increased debt after the pandemic, this will be very difficult to achieve and could actually be counterproductive. I hope that on this more technical field, there's room for a compromise. Discussions about the structural deficit and a more expense-based calculation was also mentioned before already. You also need to recognize that the real interest rate and the consequential share of spending of governments for their debt service is by far lower than in the 90s. It's only about 1/3 of what governments have spent 30 years ago. So from an economic point of view, states in this interest rate environment can bear higher debt levels more easily. But it should obviously not become too high to preserve debt sustainability. And the SGP needs to ensure effectively that debt is reduced, that the rules work counter-cyclical, and no country's debt becomes unsustainable. But to be honest, personally, I think it's not excluded that there will be not a substantial change, because this is not an economic decision first and foremost. It's first and foremost a political decision. Yeah, and the 3% and 60% rules are very symbolic numbers these days. Yeah, so many countries have not been able to meet these targets, but at least they're served as a benchmark. And the question in low deficit countries will be, so what's the point of increasing the debt number from 60 to say 80 or 90% if there's again no success in achieving this number? Yeah, the Commission has been working a lot with waivers so far, so maybe they should just continue with this. So that's the line of argument I always hear. And I think that any substantial reform is only feasible if trust is built between the member states. And therefore, to be honest, high deficit countries need to make visible progress to reduce their overall debt. And that's not only a question of expenses, in my opinion, but also of economic growth and national ownership. On the other side, lower deficit countries should recognize that they need to support these countries with some more flexible solutions for this adjustment period. Overall, I think it will only work if all participants accept the foundations on which the euro was built as a stability union with a hard currency. And in this connection, to be honest, if you speak with politicians, obviously mainly in more northern countries, ideas floated of mutualizing all national debt or canceling out pandemic debt is extremely counterproductive in this debate and will just increase the mistrust. So I think I will finish with this one and will hand over back to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. GSTÄDNER. It's very, very interesting that you made this remark. I was coming out of this discussion so far quite optimistic about the ability to find compromise, but this is, primarily a discussion between economists, and the political element of all of this needs to come into play. And maybe in the second round of our questions, we can try and see and get into a bit more depth in terms of that. And I'd like to move to Professor Vettas and try and get this macro view. We talked a little bit about the foundation and the origin story of the SGP, and I'd like to pose a question specifically on that. Now, the EMU was established in spite of the great divergence between member economies, with a goal of eventually bridging these in due course, obviously. But that doesn't seem to have happened yet on quite a few levels. Do you think the SGP is partially at fault for this persistent divergence, or is it completely irrelevant to that? Sorry. I think we cannot hear you.
You can hear me now, I believe.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. I would start, to start thinking about this, you have to start from the politics of it, because this type of pact is more a commitment device towards government. So that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is, do we need such a pact? Did we need it, and do we need it looking forward? The answer there is also yes. You cannot have a common Europe, you cannot have a common currency without such a sort of disciplining device. But looking at where we are now, and then we can go back and think about the last few years. Looking at where we are now, is there a reason to revise? There is a need to revise. The main reason for that has nothing to do with whether one number is too high, one number is too low. But the way it stands right now, it is simply not credible. A couple of the previous speakers already mentioned this. There is no point in going in front of the European citizens and in front of the markets and pretending that you're going to make something work when it is extremely difficult to work. And you shouldn't just plan it so that it works only when the times are going to be good. Who knows what sort of crisis we're going to see in the next 5 or 10 years in Europe. So yes, you have to revise. And of course, it's more of a political discussion in, how exactly you're going to do it. And I'm going to counter a little bit some of the optimism that comes out of the discussion. It seems to me it's going to be a very difficult discussion over the next couple of years, which way we want this to move. Let me insist a little bit on the issue of credibility, why the rules have to be credible. And this is primarily important for economies like Greece. We've been through a 10-year adventure. I guess none of us can forget. This adventure, you can say lots of things about what we did right, what we did wrong, whose fault it was, but it was a major adventure that resulted to a very deep recession, to a huge investment gap. And the main reason for that was the lack of credibility of the policies and the lack of visibility. Each one of us who lived in this country during those 10 years, we had no clue how the next 2 or 3 weeks would be often. So any sort of changes in the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact that are going to make it more uncertain and they're going to increase the uncertainty both for the citizens and the markets and ownership issues is just going to fail. That's one thing I wanted to say. Second thing I want to say is that the rules are necessarily incomplete. There have to be some sort of discussion amongst economists as to which way you're going to go. But let me just give you a sense of this incompleteness. Pretty much everything is tied to how we measure GDP. And at very turbulent times, GDP means sometimes less than we pretend it means. Take, for example, economies like Ireland that are extreme in that, but GDP doesn't necessarily represent how the domestic economy is doing because of the way flows are measured. Then there is the issue that was raised before about climate change. We are trying to focus on an additional 1 or 2% deficit or 1 or 2% debt. But if one takes the climate change discussion seriously, and I think we cannot afford not to, then this whole discussion about passing on too much debt to our children and grandchildren becomes second order relative to the climate change discussion. Let me conclude with a couple of remarks that have to do with why I view this discussion critical, but that's only part of the discussion I believe we should be having in Europe. And there are ways out. For instance, and I'm not necessarily proposing this, but you could leave a large part of these rules pretty much unchanged if you try to use other instruments. For instance, suppose that what you do put on the table is, let's call it an RRF2. So you can have common investment plus reforms at the European level, even past COVID, because it was the COVID pandemic that actually made RRF a necessity or a political feasibility. Now you could, through instruments like these, proceed with a better mutualization of decisions. That would be a way that another substitute to what at the beginning Professor HARDOUVELIS mentioned, that we are lacking a common finance ministry in Europe. So we're going to a world where we're trying to substitute for that. Well, you could actually have EU-level programs. However, let me tie this and now conclude with what you asked me at the beginning. Has the Pact succeeded in has it, if you're looking back, was it a success? Now, it should be, I think we should stress, and I'm stressing this in a perhaps negative tone, that you could have a monetary union that works well, and you could have members of that union that suffer. And let's think of, for instance, of the US. Okay, the US is actually a lot more than a monetary union. It's a country. So you do have fiscal transfers, you do have migration, but you do have areas that are poor and areas that are rich. And capital votes by investing where its return is high. And of course, people vote with their feet. So if you happen to be born in West Virginia, and I have nothing against Virginia, I've been a few times, it's really beautiful there, and the people are great. But if they want to go where their productivity and their incomes are going to be higher, they move to probably San Francisco or New York or Chicago. Mm-hmm. And then, at difficult times, the federal government spends more for unemployment or for schools and so on and so forth, and life goes on. However, there is one difference. That's a federal state. We don't have a federal Europe. And the reason I'm saying this is because no matter what we do with the Pact, and here I'm going to differ a little bit with one of the positions before, I would not like to put stability at a higher level than growth. Mm-hmm. We need to be, we need to take both equally seriously, because we cannot have stability in Europe without growth. Mm-hmm. But having said that, we cannot substitute, this is not going to substitute for the job of the national politicians, mm-hmm. Who have to push for structural reforms that are going to attract productive capital, most importantly, attract productive people, build welfare state that works. Mm-hmm. So in an ideal world, you need a more effective and flexible EU level pact. You need policies that are going to make the capital union, the labor markets more united and all that. Mm-hmm. But in the end of the day, this is not going to substitute for what we have to do within each country, because there are independent and different countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor. And I think this need for greater fiscal union, perhaps, is something that has been underlined by the speakers, and I'd like to get a bit deeper into that in our second round of questions. The problem is we have limited time, and you all made very, very interesting remarks in the first portion. So I would like to pose one more question to each of you, but I'd like to ask you to keep your answer quite brief so that we can finish relatively close to the originally anticipated time, if that's okay with you. And I'd like to get to Mr. DARVAS again and try and see once again on this question of economic convergence based on these lessons of the recent past, which Professor Vettas also highlighted. Can the SGP be used to pave the way for greater economic convergence between EU countries, which at the end of the day is the goal, if I'm not mistaken?
Very much agree that indeed economic convergence is a goal and also is a necessity, because continued divergence could indeed, stretch the limits of the monetary union. Italy 30 years ago had the same GDP per capita as Germany. Now Italy is 25% lower. If this trend continues, then Italians will be dissatisfied with their membership in the monetary union, maybe with the EU as well. And who knows what political outcomes would happen. So I think convergence is absolutely necessary also for the sustainability of the Euro project and the European Union. But on the other hand, I'm rather skeptical whether fiscal rules are the right tool for fostering convergence. And in fact, I have some sympathy, but what Mr. Ferber said at the beginning, that to a large degree, the problems of Italy and also some other Southern European countries, including Greece, is homemade. because simply unsustainable policies were followed in these countries. Also, structural reforms lag behind. I mean, if you look at any indicators on how easy it is to do business, I mean, we do find it's much more difficult to do it in Southern Europe than in Western Europe. And, you know, fiscal rules cannot make a big change to that. And, you know, at the same time, you know, now these countries have very high levels of debt. So I think what Europe can do, which was indeed done with Next Generation EU, is at a time of a very big external shock, because indeed the pandemic was an external shock. It's offering a helping hand. I mean, because most of the recovery money is going to Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. So helping these countries in these extraordinary circumstances, providing additional funding. But I mean, fiscal sustainability is absolutely necessary. That should be achieved. Now, I also very much on the view that the current fiscal framework is not a good tool for achieving fiscal sustainability. So there will be need for changes to that. But I'm also convinced that, you know, just relaxing the rule, allowing larger budget deficit would not solve the economic problems of Southern European countries, and it would not trigger more convergence. Mm-hmm. So let me stop here for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DARVAS. And of course, you know, asking for a relaxation of the rules, if you're a Southern European country, which in the past has not adhered to them at all, is a difficult proposition, certainly. And that's something that I'd like to ask Professor ARGHYROU. Now, a relaxation of the debt rules is no guarantee that countries will proceed with structural reforms that would increase their competitiveness. So my question would be, without a sound framework for fiscal stability, how can countries like Greece make sure that we can avoid the mistakes that led to the European debt crisis in the first place?
Yes, that is a very interesting question, but first, let me say that I totally believe that sound public finances are a prerequisite for sustainable long-term growth. Don't get me wrong on what I'm about to say. You're asking whether you're saying a relaxation of European debt rules is no guarantee that countries will proceed with structural reforms. But let me flip the statement and say that the existence of very strict fiscal rules is not a guarantee, as we have seen, that countries will proceed with structural reforms. So, again, let's take what I would call a grown-up approach to this. Fiscal policy must be sustainable, no question about that. At the same time, fiscal policy is part of the macro policy tool. There are times that you need to be passive, fiscal-wise, and there are times that you need to be active, fiscal-wise. Whether this is sustainable or not is whether markets believe you that you are going to use fiscal policy in the right way at the right time. And I think, going beyond the discussion we are having on fiscal rules and linking with your question on reforms and competitiveness, the guarantee for both long-term sustainability, fiscal-wise and competitiveness-wise, is ownership, social ownership, as well as political ownership of a mainstream economic program. And here, let me say that the story of Greece is rather a story where people can think optimistic about. In what sense? We have had our problems in this country, we know about them. And the outcome of this long and quite painful learning process, in my view at least, was that there has been a collective appreciation of the necessity of reform. And the process of public choice that took place here 2.5 years ago was that the country decided to move on to a new economic model, which will be able to improve both fiscal balances, but at the same time do reforms. And that's what we have been doing. And there is a lot of work to be done, but the results have started already being evident. So I think that the real guarantee in order to achieve both sustainable public finances as well as sustainable growth is, on the one hand, ownership, which means that you need to convince people that some things are necessary and they have to take place. And at the same time, since our economies in Europe are so integrated and so interconnected, appreciation at the union level that we need each other, and therefore we must put together at the union level the most efficient economic program that will allow everybody to have a win-win. And I think that the contrast of the experience of 2011, 2014 with the experience of the current pandemic period, at least when it comes to the impact of the crisis, is very telling. Now we coordinated much better, and that is why the result so far has been much better, despite the fact that the shock was really enormous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's truly fascinating. The fact that we have this change of reaction from Europe between the two crises, and very, very different effects so far on individual economies and how the crisis was felt in each time. Now, I would like to get to talk a little bit more, since we have a little bit more time, about whether we are asking too much of the SGP. You mentioned individual government ownership of fiscal responsibility, and that was an important parameter that we need to take into account. But also this idea that we need each other, and that comes from individual member states. Are we asking too much from this framework of the SGP? And I'd like to pose that question to you, Dr. GSTÄDNER. And as a follow-up to that, how can the SGP ever be successful if the EMU is made up of economies that adopt different fiscal, banking, but even energy policies? We've seen how important the energy environment can be for inflation and for growth over the past few months.
Thanks a lot for this question. It's tricky because it combines banking and also energy policy, which I'm not very familiar with. But what comes to my mind are 3 points here. Yeah, in the discussion about debt and deficit levels, the other part of the equation, the importance of growing GDP should not be forgotten. It's actually a very, very important point. Growing economies are the best safeguard against high debt levels. Yeah, and if you have countries in the Eurozone which have barely grown since the euro was introduced, it's not a surprise that the debt is not shrinking, and we have such economies. And here, productivity plays a key role. If you look at the productivity growth in the Eurozone, it should be improved all across all countries, but there are also quite substantial differences in the development of productivity amongst the member states. And this productivity gap often reflects the difference between high debt countries and lower debt countries, often not always. Therefore, structural reforms are of great importance for the Euro system. Implementing appropriate structural policies can make economies more resilient to economic shocks, so increasing price and wage stability, shortening or decreasing administrative and judicial proceedings, supporting the swift reallocation of resources within and across sectors via modern insolvency laws. There are a lot of possibilities that each and every member state has already right now. They don't need an approval from the European Union. They probably would even get a clap on the shoulder if they would do this. But that's actually very important in order to, let's say, balance out the debt reduction target of the Stability and Growth Pact and increasing the competitiveness and the growth of the economy. So a lot of things could already be done by national member states, and they should do this. And this would also help not to overburden the SGP. And the second point, of course, you also need some more and stronger coordination in other policy areas. Yeah. So the EU has been quite successful actually in some areas in the last years. So in the area of banking policy, for example, supervision and resolution has been fully transferred from a national to a European level. And this is very important. So there are some things which still need to be done. So banking union should be completed, but there is progress, and it was consciously decided to make progress also in these areas because it stabilizes the currency union. And the last point, fiscal tools are macro stabilizers, and they're very important. We spoke about this already. But you also have integrated credit and capital markets as macroprudential stabilization tools. And I think policies to create European capital and credit markets are by far less controversial than, for example, decisions on a European fiscal policy. So integrated capital and credit markets are very effective tools to make the EMU more stable. This is also something you have seen in other countries. Yeah. So if you look, for example, to the US or Canada, so federal states, or Germany before the euro was introduced, integrated capital and credit markets have been more effective macroprudential stabilizers than fiscal policies. And I think they are less controversial. So I would also focus on this in order to take, let's say, the burden from the SGP in order to bear everything. Yeah, I think you still need have a strong and a binding SGP, but you should also have other areas which are harmonized. And here, credit, capital markets, a banking union are very, very important in this regard. So I would like to close with this. Sorry for not touching upon energy policies. But
no, it's okay. I think you've given us plenty to think about, and especially this need to focus on other things that are perhaps less politically toxic than a fiscal union, which tends to be a big to create quite the reaction in certain countries. That's a very, very interesting point to bear in mind. And I'd like to focus a little bit more on that with my final question to Professor Vetas. Now, looking at the history of the EMU, again, I'd like to get your sense of what the verdict is thus far regarding the question of whether it is possible to have a successful monetary union without a fiscal union. That's a big question. And I think at the end of the day, it has a lot to do with the SGP and how we decide to reform it. And also, as a follow-up, you did mention earlier the example of the US, which is, of course, a country, not just a fiscal union. But it is a competitor at the same time in global markets. And I was wondering, does the euro as a currency have an inherent disadvantage against currency rivals like the dollar, which are backed by a US economy that has that flexibility, that has that ability, a large federal budget at its disposal to influence policy in a more coordinated and efficient manner?
You're asking deep and difficult questions.
Thank you.
I guess the glass is half full. So we have accomplished certain positive results in Europe, but certainly not as much as we could have done if various types of economic policies were coordinated. But this is because of the way democracy works. And in fact, that democracy works primarily at the national level. That's where we elect our governments. So when you go to the European level, necessarily you have some level of incompleteness. I think, there is this, how they say, there is an elephant in the room. I think there are several elephants in the room. So one elephant in the room is, I think it's interesting, none of us thus far mentioned the word inflation. Inflation is viewed differently by the North and the South, and is viewed differently by those who have high debts, because some level of inflation, you remember central bankers always used to have this 2% in mind, which is also debated, but we have been far from that the last few years, and this is a sort of lubricant when you have high debts, public debts as well as private debts. So whether we want to have this or whether we want to have more monetary stability, it's going to be, one big question. That's one. The other thing is that we are measuring national public debt, but this is also incomplete. And part of the political economy discussion is going to be that in Europe, on average, we're getting older. Part of this is good news because we live longer. But this means that more and more of our public expenditure is going towards pensions. And pensions are not directly measured in this discussion of national debt versus GDP. Countries do not have balance sheets. It's not as if we have the value of our assets and the value of our liabilities and all of those liabilities go in there. So what we are measuring here is only a very incomplete proxy of what sort of fiscal pressure we're going to have in the coming years and decades, and pensions, and the degree to which we want to shift resources away from pensions and perhaps making the new generations more productive. It's going to be a huge, huge discussion. The third little elephant in the room is, of course, structural reforms. And structural reforms often have a very troublesome form, which is that You reform today, you have to pay a political cost, and also you have to invest more today, because remember, when we invest more, it also means to some extent that we are consuming less, so that we can have more production and more consumption in the future. But in democracies, and especially democracies that are incompletely linked at the European level, this is not always a feasible equation. So the reason I'm mentioning these various elephants in the room, and I could continue with more elephants, is that we are coming out of a 2-year crisis. As again, Gikas HARDOUVELIS said, crises should not be wasted. They should lead to policy reform. But my sense is that my sense and my fear, my gut feeling is that this discussion will be ongoing for the next couple of years, and the next couple of years will not be completely uneventful. So it's probably going to be some external push that is probably going to push us to act. Nonetheless, and I'm finishing with this, mindful of time, there are economies like Greece that are very much away from their, let's call it, production possibilities. We have a large investment gap, we have high unemployment, we have a pool of people abroad. And the last thing we want to do, as we proceed to fiscal consolidation, which we have to do because it's a matter of credibility, is to proceed to the easy, let's call it, expenditure cuts, and not the ones that would be more productive.
Thank you so much, Professor, and especially for acknowledging all of these elephants in the room, because I think if we don't, it's going to be very, very difficult to reach that golden ratio that we mentioned at the beginning of this event. And I for one, feel more optimistic now. There are a few things that we all seem to agree on. A simpler SGP, a simpler framework, a more transparent framework, a more binding and credible framework. I think these are things that we can all somewhat agree on. And that's a basis, at least, for the discussion in the future. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you all for all of these insightful remarks and for keeping to the time limits that we had for this discussion. A big thank you to the organizer of this event, the Hans Seidel Foundation and the Institute for Democracy, Konstantinos Karamanlis. And of course, a very big thank you to our audience for staying with us while we discuss this important topic for the future of the European Union. Good evening to all.